Okay.
Yeah, because we have that link also and we have circulated it very heavily. Rajan, I'm starting. Okay. Good morning to Dr. Gabriel Bo in Argentina and all our friends in Argentina, and good evening to my all colleagues in India. And we are extremely grateful for Dr. Gabriel to accept our invitation. And let me introduce him. You know, Dr. Gabriel Bo is the president of the Institute of the Reproduction in Animal Cordoba, and he's also a professor at the University at Cordoba in Argentina. He received his DVM in Argentina in 1985 and his Master of Veterinary Science in 1991, and doctorate degree from University of Saskatoon, Canada. Dr. Bo has been working for many years on applied research and commercial application of fixed-time AI and embryo technologies. He is past president of the International Embryo Transfer Society. And let me tell you, he is the only member of the IETS who was elected twice to be as a president of the society in 2004 and 2011. And he is a founding member of the president of the Argentina Embryo Technology Society. He has lectured in numerous short courses on advanced reproductive technologies and delivered lectures in almost all Latin American countries, as well as United States, Canada, Spain, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, amongst the others. He has been as an invited speaker and a workshop participant at several meetings around the world, including the IETS, International Congress on Animal Reproduction, and then the World Bureautic Congress. I myself had an opportunity to hear him on many occasions. Finally, he has published more than 130 manuscripts in referred journals and book chapters, and more than 200 invited reviews, and more than 470 abstracts in a conference proceedings at venues around the world. Finally, Dr. Bo has obtained several awards like the Taurus Award from Argentina, the IETS Distinguished Service Award, the Scientist of the Year Award from the SBTE Brazil, and he has been recently named member of the National Academy of Agriculture and Veterinary Sciences of Argentina. And he is an honorary member of the American College of Theriogenologists, USA. Finally, Dr. Bo is the recipient of the 2020 Simmer Prize for Assisted Reproduction, giving the International Congress on Animal Reproduction. The prize, which is the most prestigious award in animal reproduction and one of the largest of its kind, was given for the pioneering efforts of Dr. Bo to develop practical protocols for fixed-time artificial insemination, superovulation, and embryo transfer in cattle. With this introduction of Dr. Gabriel Bo, sir, I would like to tell you something about our group. We have a group of about 90 people, 90 members of bovine embryo transfer, which we have named it. And there are about 30 IVF labs in the country, and they are almost about in the, say, 1 year to, I can say, 6-year-old. And out of the 30, there are about 10 labs which have been run at the university level, and there are 10 labs which are with the different animal husbandry department of the states, and about another 8 to 10 private labs which are emerging up in the country. Now, we had all of majority of the members had an experience of doing MOET, but for last few years, last 4 or 5 years, we have shifted to IVF and trying our best. Definitely, as we are at a initial stages, we have a lot of teething problems, and we are trying to get experience from learned speakers like you. So our group is really grateful for you accepting our invitation, and we would like to hear you, and we are trying to improve our performance. That's the whole objective. And with this introduction, sir, further, I mean, I, on the behalf of the Bovine Embryo Transfer Group, and also I am a national mentor for the IVF program in the country, appointed by the Ministry of Animal Husbandry, our Union Government of India. So on their behalf, I welcome you for this session, and we look forward to hear from you. Over to you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I really like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I hope that you find what I want to tell you is interesting. And well, without any further ado, I'm going to start with a presentation that I prepared based on what we have talked. The title of my presentation is Strategies to Simplify in vitro and in vivo and in vitro embryo production. I will talk a little bit about in vivo, but then I will talk more about in vitro, and I also welcome any questions that you may have. When we are talking about embryo technologies in a genetic improvement program, for many years we have used the superovulation and embryo collection and transfer as means of improving our cattle. But nowadays, as you mentioned, in India and in many places of the world, IVF is starting to take over what is the main embryo production. If we look at the IETS Data Retrieval Committee, which tried to gather most of the information about the commercial embryo transfer activities around the world, you can see here that there's this is the total number of embryos transferred around the world, and this is the in vivo produced embryos, and these are the in vitro produced embryos. As you can see, there was a constant increase in vitro embryo production over the years, and in 2016 we have a shift towards more IVP embryos being produced in the world compared to MOET embryos. This growth has been different in different parts of the world. Probably South America was the first region in the world that increased in vitro embryo production, and now has been followed by North America, mainly for the use of in vitro embryo production for genetic improvement using prepubertal cows. When we looked at the statistics around the world, IVF and IVP has been used either for dairy or beef cattle, and these are the average number of embryos collected per procedure, means OPU for in vitro embryos and embryo collection for in vivo embryos. In beef cows, you see that there's no significant difference in the number of embryos produced between in vivo and in vitro production. And in dairy, there are about 6 embryos obtained by superovulation and about 3.6 embryos obtained on average from a dairy donor. And I will try to explain why this happened and how we can try to improve that. Because if you looked at the world statistics, most of the in vitro donors are from hosting or dairy breeds, but mainly hosting cows. One of the problems that we have to acknowledge over the years is that there are some things that we can improve, and there are some other things that we need to live with. And this is the same for in vitro and in vivo embryo production, which is the tremendous variability that we have among donors, because there are some big difference between donors that are going to be difficult to overcome. The main reason is that not all donors will have the same follicle population. So if we looked at this data from the group in Ireland, in which they looked at number of follicles at the beginning of follicular wave, and these were all hostings in Ireland, or hosting Frisians in Ireland, you see that some cows only have 5 follicles, per follicular wave, and some cows have 65 follicles. Of course, if you are going to do a superovulation, or if you're going to do an in vitro procedure, you're going to get a lot more embryos from these cows than from these cows. Now, the problem is that until we actually evaluate the cows, we don't know who is going to be this type of donor. But what we know now that this thing is established at birth. So practically at the time of birth, there are some heifers that will have a lot of follicles and have some heifers that will not have many follicles. And we are going to come back to it later. Here is some data from Jeswant Singh. Jeswant Singh, as you probably know him, he's originally from India. He's professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and I have the pleasure to work with him. And in 2004, he took a group of cows at the University of Saskatchewan, and he scanned them at the time of follicular wave emergence and divided the cows in two groups. The cows that have less than 30 follicles per follicular wave, and the cows that have more than 30 follicles per follicular wave. He selected those cows in those two groups, and then he put them back, the cows were sent back from to pasture. Then a month later, approximately, they were synchronized again, and they counted the number of follicles again. So this is the first time when the cows were selected. This is the second time when they did repeat the experiment. And this is the third time when they superstimulated the cows with a small dose of FSH, excuse me, to do a follicle aspiration. And as you can see, the cows with more follicles always were the cows with more follicles. So this is a repeatable. So if you have a donor that has a lot of follicles, this trend will be repeated over and over again. So we have cows with a high number of follicles or high follicle population, and we have cows with low follicle population. One of the ways to select those cows is by counting the follicles at the time of follicular wave emergence. And one of the things that we do here in Argentina is to treat these cows with a dose of estradiol benzoate and progesterone, and then we counted the follicles at the time of follicular wave emergence, which is about 4 days later. And by then we can pre-select the cows. And usually we divide the cows in those that have more than 25 follicles, those that have between 15 to 25 follicles, and those that have less than 15 follicles. Another way that you can use to select these cows for follicle population is by taking a blood sample and measure anti-Mullerian hormone. And anti-Mullerian hormone is a hormone that is produced by mostly by secondary follicles and small antral follicles, and is related to follicle population, as you can see in this graph on the right side. And this is an experiment that was done by Alex Souza in the US, where he superstimulated hosting cows, and he divided these hosting donors based on their MAH concentrations in the lowest ones to the highest ones. And you can see that it went from 3.1 transferable embryos in the cows that have a very low MAH levels to 7.2 transferable embryos in the cows that have a high MAH levels. So you can actually use either MAH, or it's cheaper actually to do a follicle count, provided that you have a good ultrasound machine to select your donors. And if you select donors that have a high number of follicles, then you're going to be more successful in your embryo production. Superovulation has been one of our old friends. We've been working with superovulations for more than 40 years. I've been involved with superovulation since I started my graduate studies in 1988. Superovulation requires a consistent production of embryos that you can actually transfer fresh or you can freeze, and is based on the use mainly of follicle stimulating hormone. Before we started treatments, we found that it's better to synchronize the follicle wave, and over the years we have used several tools to try to synchronize the follicle wave. One of them is called follicle ablation, which is called DFR, in which we aspirate the two largest follicles present in the ovaries on one time, and then we superovulate them 1.5 days later. Or we can use estradiol in countries where estradiol is available. We are actually in Argentina, we are mainly using estradiol 17 beta, 5 milligrams with an injection of progesterone. Or you can use GnRH. The problem with GnRH is that it's dependent on the dominant follicle, and we have a considerable variability. And we are looking at ways that we can improve now in some experiments that we are actually doing currently, and which I probably show you the results by the time of the IETS. Basically, when we do a superovulation, this is a protocol that we normally use in Argentina, in which we still superovulate some beef donors. We use a progesterone releasing device, and we inject progesterone estradiol 17 beta, and we synchronize the recipients on the same day. So donors and recipients are synchronized on the same day. Then we treat the cows with FSH, and usually we remove the progesterone releasing device with the last FSH treatment. And depending if she's a Bos Indicus or a Bos Taurus, we usually give GnRH about 24 hours later, and we eye them twice, and we collect the embryo 7 days after estrus or GnRH. And in the recipients, we are using what we call a J-Sync protocol, which is a shorter estradiol-based protocol, in which we use estradiol benzoate on day 0. We usually use devices with a low amount of progesterone. We are using devices with 0.7 grams of progesterone. The device is removed on day 6. The cows receive prostaglandin and ECG, and then we expect them to be in heat on 3 days later. If they are not in heat by 3 days later, they receive GnRH, and then we do the transfer the same day that we collect. If we are going to do follicular aspirations, then usually we aspirate the cows on day 9 or the day earlier. So then we transfer the embryos on day 16 and 17. And this is the protocol that we are getting the best results right now. We are either using a 6-day, what we call a 6-day J-Sync, or a 7-day J-Sync. And we can talk about that later if you want. For superovulation, in countries where we do not have estradiol available, or actually now in Argentina, if a country is certified for the European Union, we cannot use estradiol, so we need to use GnRH. And because GnRH does not induce ovulation of the dominant follicle all the time, we develop this protocol in which we create a persistent follicle by giving a progesterone releasing device for 7 days and prostaglandin at the time that we insert the device. That creates a persistent follicle, and then we induce ovulation with GnRH. And by doing that, we found that we can increase ovulation rate, and by doing that, we are synchronizing the follicle wave in a lot more cows than we are just using GnRH alone. So then we develop a protocol in which cows are given prostaglandin. We were using, in this experiment, a Qmate device, which is produced in New Zealand, and it has 1.56 grams of progesterone. We gave GnRH 7 days later to induce ovulation and synchronize the follicle wave. And then 36 hours later, we started with FSH. Then the cows were inseminated 12 and 24 hours after LH or GnRH, and then we did the embryo collection. And when we compare, we evaluated how many cows ovulated to that first GnRH, and we found that ovulation rate was 89%. And when we looked at embryo collection, we compared that with the estradiol protocol. And as you can see, we found the same number of embryos. These were semental donors, and these were hosting cows, in which we found the same number of transferable embryos when we use this GnRH protocol compared to the estradiol protocol. So this is an alternative protocol that we can use if we want to superstimulate cows. One of the things that we have also been working lately is to try to simplify the superovulation protocols by trying to avoid the number of injections. As you know, with superovulation, we need to give 8 injections of FSH over 4 days, and this create a lot of compliance problems. So one of the things that we try is to try to eliminate as much as we can the number of injections required to superovulate the cow. We have done several things, and this is, I'm going to show you now what we've been doing lately. We are combining FSH with ECG. ECG, as you know, is produced by the mare, and it's a molecule that has 2 subunits, an alpha subunits and a beta subunits, and it has a long half-life. But the advantage of ECG is that if we use a reduced dose, we can replace the last 4 injections of FSH with 1 small dose of ECG. In the old days, ECG was used to superovulate cows, but we were using very high dosages. And these very high dosages created a lot of problems and a lot of anovulated follicles. We are also now working with a recombinant ECG that is produced in Argentina, which has a shorter half-life and is giving us very nice results. This was one of the first studies that we did, in which we compare donors from different breeds. These are Bos indicus crosses that were superstimulated either with 8 injection of Voltropin or another protocol in which we replace the last 4 injections of Voltropin with 1 injection of ECG. So in this experiment we did in Bos taurus and Bos indicus donors, all received 4 injections of FSH, so the first 2 days, and then we replaced the 5th injection with an injection of ECG. In the first study, we used 600 units of ECG, and then we moved to 400 units. And these are the results that we have. As you can see here, when we looked at the Bos taurus donors, there was no difference in the number of transferable embryos obtained. And when we looked at the number of anovulated follicles, there was no difference again. When we looked at the Bos indicus donors, when we used FSH, it was better than using the combination of FSH by ECG. But one of the things that we found in this experiment is that the number of anovulated follicles was very high. So then in the next study, we decided to reduce that dose. And in actual fact, we have done a study previously in which we have reduced the dose of ECG for Bos indicus donors to 400 international units. And as you can see here, when we use these 400 international units to replace the FSH, we actually got more transferable embryos compared to just using a FSH. So this is one way that we can actually solve some of the problems related to giving multiple injections. Of course, the other alternative is to use a recombinant FSH, but unfortunately, we still don't have a recombinant FSH available for use in cattle. It is available in humans, but not in cattle. What we have developed through a group in Argentina is a recombinant ECG. We are now working with a recombinant FSH as well, but I'm going to show you some of the results that we have already published about the use of a recombinant ECG. This molecule, as I said, is similar to the native ECG, but it's the molecular weight is a bit smaller, so the half-life is a bit shorter. So one of the things that we are using now in these same superovulation protocols that I showed you before, instead of using 400 or 600 units of the serum-derived ECG or the mare-derived ECG, we are using 140 and 210 international units of the recombinant ECG with comparable results. So we are slowly replacing animal-derived products with recombinant products, and I think this is one way that we'll see in the near future for most of the gonadotropins that we use. The other interesting activity that we work with is in vitro embryo production. As you know, in vitro embryo production, as I said before, has been taken over in vivo embryo production. And as you have mentioned before, this is the same in India. There are some alternatives by which we can do IVF, but the best way is to do OPU, which is aspirating the donors with ultrasound-guided follicular aspiration. And there are different alternatives to obtain the oocytes by OPU. One of the alternatives is to use OPU without any type of follicular control, which some people call that the Brazilian approach. And the other alternative is to use follicle wave synchronization, which we have worked with, and other colleagues in Brazil has worked with as well, and or use what we call the North American approach, which is using FSH or stimulation with gonadotropins to produce those oocytes for IVP. This is data from our lab in which we use no synchronization at all. We just no FSH or no follicular wave synchronization. And this is data collected from our lab in which we aspirated Holsteins, Angus, and Bosmara, which are going to be Bos Taurus beef breeds. These are Bos Indicus crosses, Brangus and Bradford, and these are Brahman, which are a Bos Indicus breed.
original data दाखवलाय.
Somebody is talking, so if you can mute, please. Thanks. And if you see, there was a significant number of embryos produced in the Bos Indicus animals compared to the Bos Taurus animals. So with the Bos Taurus animals, especially with the Holstein breed, and especially if we use sex semen, we had some handicap that the number of blastocysts produced are not very high. In Argentina, we were producing only 1.6 blastocysts aspirated when we did not use any treatment. And as you saw around the world, the average number of embryos produced is about 3. So there's 2 alternatives. Or you put more cows to aspirate, or you try to improve the production of embryos in the animals that you have. When you have genetically superior animals, especially if you have genomic animals, you try to get the most as you can with those donors that you know are the best for the type of selection that you want to do. So there's always variation, and this is data from our friend Yeda Watanabe. She probably has shown you this data, in which even though in Bos Indicus you have more oocytes than Bos Taurus, you still have a tremendous variation. So here you have the aspiration from Nelor, here you have the aspiration from Gyr, here you have Holsteins, and here you have Senepols. So look at the Gyr. With the Gyr, you get more oocytes compared to the Holsteins, but you still have some cows that will produce only a low number of oocytes. And with an Nelor, it's the same. You see, you have some cows that has given up to 175. I remember a friend of mine, Luis Nasser, aspirated a cow some years ago, which he collected more than 300 oocytes in one aspiration. But these are the extremes. So on average, you're going to get about this number of oocytes, but there's always this problem. And if your genetically superior animal is within this range, then you need to do something to improve. How and the other thing is this is very important, that is one cow does not give you a lot of embryos on the first time, most likely she will not give you embryos unless you do something about it. And this is an experiment that was done by my friend Pietro Baruzelli, where they aspirated Nelor donors 30 days apart for a whole year, and they did not do any manipulation, but they looked at embryo production in all those donors. And what they looked at is the repetitivity of embryos produced. And you can see the repeatability of the recovered cumulus oocyte complex was very, very high, was 81% compared to in those donors. So that, what does it mean? that cows that give you a lot of oocytes on the first time will most likely give you a lot of oocytes all the time. And if you have a cow that does not have many follicles and you don't get many embryos, most likely you are not going to produce a lot of embryos out of that given donor. So then you have to do something about it. One way that we can try to improve this is by doing synchronization of follicle wave emergence. And in practical ways, we can use the same protocol that were developed for superovulation. So we can use follicle ablation and then let the follicle start and then give it a couple days for the follicles to grow, and then they do a follicle aspiration. Or we can use estradiol, or we can use GnRH. And this is an experiment that we've done in Argentina with one of my graduate students some years ago, in which we compare in Brangus and Angus donors the use of follicle wave synchronization compared to no synchronization. And as you can see, we have a significantly higher number of oocytes collected when we use follicle wave manipulation compared to no manipulation at all. This is another experiment that is more recent from the group in Brazil, from Marcelo Ceneda's group, and they use in the lower donors, and you can see they compare cows that were aspirated at random days of the estrous cycle with cows that were aspirated after an injection of 2 milligrams of estradiol benzoate and injection of prostaglandin to get rid of the CL, and they put a progesterone releasing device for 5 days. On day 5, they did the ovum pickup, and when you see here the number of oocytes obtained when the follicle wave was synchronized, you can see that there was no significant difference in the number of oocytes. But when we looked at the number of embryos produced, the number of embryos produced was significantly higher when we synchronized the follicle wave compared to no synchronization. And what is the reason for that? Well, the number of oocytes or the number of follicles are going to be the same, but the number of the quality of those oocytes are going to be better because you have a more synchronized pool of follicles by which you can aspirate. So by doing that, you get better embryos. And in this experiment, they have also more conceptions after transfer when they use a follicle wave synchronization before OPU in those donors. So there's some things that you could do about to try to improve your embryo production. The other thing is why people in North America prefer to use FSH as well. Well, the main reason is that in North America, people are using Bostaurus donors and mainly Holsteins, which are probably the breed that have the smallest follicle population of all breeds that we work with. And the other thing is that they prefer to collect follicles that are larger in size because they found that when they collect follicles that are larger than 7 millimeters in diameter, the capacity or the competence of those oocytes is better, and they actually produce more embryos for the number of oocytes that they aspirate. So they can improve the number of embryos produced by increasing the size of those follicles. So Patrick Blondin from Canada have done a lot of work, and we have also done some research with Pietro Baruzelli in Brazil and some others in Argentina, in which we use a synchronized follicle wave with estradiol and a progesterone releasing device, and a group of cows that were treated with 4 injections of foltropin. In here, we use the half dose of foltropin, 200 milligrams, injected twice daily for 2 days. And then after 40 years of coasting, we did the OPU. When we compare that to the controls, which were not receiving any FSH, they were synchronized the follicle wave, but they did not receive any FSH. You can see here that the number of follicle aspirated was the same, but the medium-sized follicles was larger when we did the cow superstimulated, so the follicle population was different. And what is more important, the number of blastocysts produced was significantly higher. And here you see why there were more blastocysts produced, not because there were more oocytes aspirated. It's because there were more embryos produced out of those blastocysts, out of those oocytes that were aspirated 7 days earlier. So actually, by giving FSH, and especially by aspirating follicles that are a bit larger, we are increasing the possibilities of those oocytes to become transferable embryos. We have also done another experiments in which we combine foltropin with hyaluronan. Hyaluronan, or hyaluronic acid, is a compound that is mainly used for treatments of joints in horses. Actually, this is a product that is sold in the US. It is called MAP5, and it's mainly used for treatment of horses. And we have done an experiment, again, with Holsteins, in which we compare using 4 injections of FSH or 1 single injection of FSH diluted in hyaluronan, which is commercially called MAP5. And we use 2 doses. We use 200 or 300 milligrams of foltropin, given only 1 day. And then the aspiration was done 72 hours later. So when we compare the production, here are the FSH levels in the blood. In the orange, you see the FSH in the cows that were treated twice daily. So every time you inject a cow, the FSH increases and then goes down because of the half-life. When you give the 200 milligrams IM in hyaluronan, actually the FSH lasts in circulation for about 36 to 48 hours. And when we give 300 milligrams, we have a higher peak, which we thought was going to be better, but actually was not that better. When we looked at the embryo production, these are the number of follicles aspirated, and you can see these are the control cows, and these are the cows treated with FSH. And you see that the number of follicles are a bit higher when we use FSH, but the distribution of those follicles is the most important thing. You see the number of small follicles was very high in the control groups, but in the other groups, in the FSH treated group, the largest population was the medium-sized follicle, those follicles that are between 6 and 9 millimeters in diameter. And the number of large follicles was also a bit higher. But the main important thing is that those follicles, those medium follicles, were all what we were interested with. So if you look at the ovary, this is what you would see in the control cows, and this is what you would see in the animals treated. So you see more follicles to aspirate. It's a lot easier to aspirate. You need to change the needle, though. You need to use an 18-gauge needle and increase a little bit the pressure, but you actually get better oocytes to produce more embryos. And when we looked at the number of embryos produced, as you can see here, in the 3 treatment groups, we have better embryo production compared to the control, and the best group was the group that were treated with 200 milligrams of foltropin. So that's half a dose of foltropin diluted in hyaluronan. Based on that, we did another study in Argentina in which we just repeat the same experiment, and we use beef donors, because in Argentina we mainly we do a lot of beef donors for superovulation, for meat production. And here again, you can see that when we use FSH, we have a higher number of cocks produced, higher number of viable embryos, and a tendency for a higher number of blastocysts produced. So in Bos taurus, we have found that by giving FSH, we are actually increasing embryo production. This is data from Daniela Demetrio. I know that she's going to give you a talk in the near future, so probably you'll see this data again. She has been using foltropin diluted in hyaluronan, and the idea of using foltropin diluted in hyaluronan is that you can only give it in 1 injections. You don't have to give injections every 12 hours. And the only difference that in the US, since they are not using estradiol, they are trying to synchronize the follicle wave by giving GnRH 1.5 days before they actually start the superstimulation treatment. And in the results that he have shown at the ITS meeting, she compared the embryo production in, these are adult donors, no FSH or one injection of FSH. And you see that she produced more grade 1 embryos and more total number of blastocysts by giving FSH compared to not giving FSH. And she did another study where she compared 5 injections of FSH or 1 injection of FSH diluted in hyaluronan, and she actually got the same result. So you can actually reduce or simplify the protocol just by giving 1 injection of FSH. If you are using estradiol and progesterone, you can use estradiol and a progesterone releasing device on day 0. Start them with FSH on day 4, and then you do the follicular aspiration on day 6 or 7. This is what we are now investigating, if it's better to do it every 48 hours after the injection or 72 hours after the injection. We are finding that probably 48 hours is better than 72, but we need to finish the experiment right now. This is another experiment that was also done by Daniela, in which she used an injection of foltropin diluted in hyaluronan or an injection of foltropin without any dilution, with the saline, and that was this was in heifers that were 9 to 15 months. They received a GnRH 36 before they receive FSH, and the OPU was done 48 to 50 hours, which I think is probably the best interval from FSH when you're giving a single injection. It's a bit different when you're giving multiple injections, but we are trying again to use simple protocols that are not very cumbersome to the farmer. And again, here you can see the results. You have more embryos again with FSH compared to no FSH. And if you compare the ones produced with hyaluronan or saline, it's about the same. So just by a single small dose of foltropin, you can actually produce more embryos. Well, now this is the summary and the conclusions of my presentation. Today we have simple and effective protocols for the in vivo and in vitro production of bovine embryos. One of the key things in an embryo production program is to identify the animals with a larger follicle population, because this greatly helps to reduce the variation in vivo and in vitro embryo production. If you have a cow that do not have many follicles, there's no much you can do other than pray, because she's not going to produce a lot of embryos, even if you use FSH. The last 2 injections of FSH, if you are doing superovulation, can be replaced with 1 of ECG. The recommended dosage is 600 units for Bos taurus and 400 units for Bos indicus. And if you are using recombinant ECG, we are reducing the dose to 210 units. Probably the development of a new recombinant molecules with long-acting FSH activity may permit the superovulation with a single injection. However, we still need an FDA-approved product to use and confirm the results. With the OPU IVF, oocyte recovery and blastocyst production have been improved by the synchronization of follicular wave immersion. And since this is the main way that you are producing embryos in India, I will recommend trying to synchronize in some ways the follicle wave. I know it's more complicated because it's a lot easier just to go to the farm and aspirate the donors, but you are going to get better oocytes and better embryos if you use some follicle wave manipulation. There is a clear evidence that superstimulation increases oocyte and embryo developmental competence, and thus blastocyst production rates. And if you are working in gear, probably this is a good way to think about. I have one PhD student in Ecuador, and he's aspirating gear donors, and he's been quite successful by using a very small dose of FSH. more recent protocols with a single administration of FSH in 0.5% hyaluronan, and be very efficacious, making protocols user-friendly while minimizing the errors in compliance. And more studies are needed to determine which is the best interval between the FSH administration and OPU. Probably 48 hours is better than 72. We still need to confirm those results. And with that, I would like to acknowledge all the people that have helped me over the years. My mentor, Dr. Ruben Mapletov from University of Saskatchewan. He still collaborates with me, so we still work together. We have been working together for more than 30 years. Dr. Pietro Baruzelli from Brazil, we've been working together as well, and Luis Nasser from 1991. And then my graduate students and colleagues in Argentina. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gabriel, for the excellent presentation. And I will now request you to have a look at the chat box, and there are some questions. So I don't want to come between those who have asked the questions. We can have a look at it and answer them directly.
Okay. One question was, what is my opinion of using a single jolt of FSH for stimulation? Definitely, I think this is an alternative, especially in OPU donors. What I would do first is to synchronize the follicle wave. So you can, the protocol that I would recommend using is synchronizing the follicle wave with GnRH 36 hours before you give FSH, or using dominant follicle removal, or using estradiol progesterone, then do the FSH, and then 48 hours to 50 hours do the OPU. You are going to have a nice group of follicles which are going to be 6 to 8 millimeters in diameter, and you are going to see that the embryos are a lot nicer to see, and they are also good. They develop very well. Okay, the other question is about the repeatability of oocyte numbers and about the semen. Yes, definitely, semen. It's an important part of our operation, especially with IVF. Not all the bulls behave very well in the IVF system. So we are trying, one of the things that we are trying to do is to minimize the error by, especially if we are going to have, if we are going to have a program, a big program, we first tested the semen with some abattoir ovaries, and before we are actually doing that. And the other thing that is we are doing more and more right now is using mixed semen from 2 or 3 bulls. And if you are using semen for 2 or 3 bulls, you're going to minimize the error due to a bull that does not behave that. Now with genomics and with DNA technologies, it's not a big problem, because then the only thing you do is simply taking a blood sample of the calves when they are born, and then you know who is the sire. And then by doing that, you can also improve embryo production. But if not, if you choose to use only one sire, what I would recommend is, especially if you are going to do a lot of donors in a program, I would first check them through with the slaughterhouse ovaries or with some of your own cows, and make sure that the bull works well, because not all the bulls work very well with IVF. And this is the same with sex semen and with conventional semen, but it's more with sex semen, so be careful with that. The other question that I have is how to reduce anovulated follicles in MOET. And well, this is one thing that we have to live with. We are trying to reduce that number by giving, in the old days, we were giving lutropin, which was an LH product derived from foltropin. And that worked very well. We were using lutropin at the time of the first insemination, and we were reducing the number of anovulated follicles. Unfortunately, we do not have lutropin anymore. So what are we using mainly now is GRH, because HCG is the other product that you can use, human chorionic gonadotropin, but it's very expensive because it's used in humans. So we are using GRH, and the GRH that we are using now is buserelin, and we are giving a cystic cow dose. We are giving 20 micrograms, so 5 ml injection of conceptal or receptal or whatever buserelin product. We have many generics in Argentina, and we are using most of them, where we are giving a big dose of GRH at the time that the cows are supposed to be in estrus. Some people give it at the time of insemination. We prefer to give it at the time of estrus. Or the expected estrus, and by doing that, we are reducing the number of anovulated follicles. The other thing is that if you are using ECG in combination with FSH, is to not use a high dose of ECG. So that's why we are using only 400 international units, and in some heifers we are using only 300 international units. So we are trying to reduce the dose of ECG as well.
So are the questions over, Dr. Gabriel?
The opinion of pulling oocytes when the number of oocytes are less, yes, this is the oocytes like company. They don't like to be by themselves. So yes, you can pull them as long as you are sure then how you're going to manage them later. So that means you can pull them, no problem. There's two things that we had to take into account. Well, it's the same as using more than one bull for semen. You had to do genomic testing or DNA testing when the calves are born. But yes, you can do that. Usually when you only have 1 or 2 oocytes, those oocytes don't develop very well. So we prefer to have more oocytes in the dish. This is not something that we do normally, but some people have done it and you can use it. And you know, when we take slaughterhouse ovaries, we just pull the oocytes from all the cows, and usually it works very well. The question is if it's good to use OPU in Red Cindy cows. I don't have personal experience with Red Cindy, but based on the experience of my friend Roberto Sartori, which he had done some work with Red Cindy, I would say yes. And gear as well, I would say gear do have a lot, some gear do have a lot of follicles, but they don't have as many as an LR. So then a small dose of FSH is probably a good idea. You're going to have to decide what dose you use, but I wouldn't use a very high dose. I would use I would start trying with a small dose. Probably at the beginning, I would try with maybe 3 or 4 ml of FSH, not very high. The problem, if we are seeing younger and younger dairy donors, well, in Argentina, we are not aspirating very young donors, but I can tell you from the experience from other people, yes. And in North America, I would say this is the largest number of donors are prepubertal donors. They are not as easy to work with, and you need to wait until you get you can find somebody with a very small hand to do the follicular aspiration. There's WTA, a company from Brazil, has developed an aspiration device which is smaller, so you can insert in the vagina without a problem. And usually with those, we use a goat breed or a goat cedar G, and we use FSH. And I would use I haven't used a single injection of FSH myself, but I think that it's probably good. How you should improve production with non-stimulation in host infriction? What I would use is synchronize the follicle wave. I think you're going to see an improvement. So then you can either synchronize the follicle wave. You can do a very simple synchronization. If you have the cows in your center, you can aspirate the two largest follicles. Then the new wave will start 1.5 days later, and then you wait another 2 days and then do the follicular aspiration. You're going to have the same number of oocytes, but you're going to have a synchronous follicular wave, so you're going to improve embryo production. The other question is about keeping the embryos at 4 degrees for short duration before fresh transfer. We actually keep the embryos at room temperature. We keep the embryos at 18 to 25 degrees. If it's very high the temperature, we try to keep it a bit fresh between 18 to 24 degrees. We have put the embryos in ice at 4 degrees for longer duration. We have, but if you're going to do that, you need a media with BSA. For example, when we were using the Vigro holding media, we were getting very good results with long-term storage of embryos. But when we moved to the Singro holding media, we were not getting very good results. So if you're going to keep the embryos long, it's better to use Vigro. We try not to keep the embryos more than 12 hours. And if you are going to maintain that 12-hour period, we keep it at room temperature. With the IVF embryos, we use the Brazilian approach, which is keeping them at 37, 38 degrees Celsius until we actually transfer. So same as incubator temperature, and we use those straw transporters that were built in WTA. What is the cost of embryo and confirmed pregnancy in Argentina to the clients? Well, it depends a lot because some people charge. I can tell you what we do normally charge. For a donor in Argentina for in vivo embryo production, we charge $250 for a superovulation and $150, a bit higher now, about $200 per confirmed pregnancy. With the IVF, we are charging $100 for an OPU session, and then we charge $260 per confirmed pregnancy. And when we talk about confirmed pregnancy, it's about 60 days. It's higher than what they charge in Brazil. Some donors have soft ovaries and yield poor quality oocytes. The reason for this, well, I think you are going to have to look at those donors is they are not obese. Obesity is, or cows that are very fat are a problem for oocyte donors. When the cows become very fat, they become like cows with diabetes, that type 2 diabetes, so they are resistant to insulin. Pietro Varicelli has studied a lot of that. And because they have high insulin, that affects oocyte quality. So what you're going to have to do with those cows is to try to reduce their body condition. So they should become thinner and in workable condition. So we try that the donors in a 1 to 5 in a 1 to 5 body condition score, we try that the donors do not go over 3.5. Actually, they are in 3 body condition, they are better. This is always a challenge because when you have those donors, they do nothing but eating grass, and they become obese. But you need to keep them very thin and not skinny, but very thin in good working condition. Unfortunately, we cannot tell the cows to do exercise as we should probably do ourselves, but at least just give them the minimum requirements for maintenance. Obesity is the biggest problem that we have with our embryo donors, and that's the biggest problem in many countries. And sometimes we cannot manage because sometimes you have a group of donors in the same pen, and some are a bit skinnier and others are a bit fat, and then that it's a big problem. The other question is, what should be the ideal gap between 2 opus? We normally do 14 days, but now we are thinking that it's probably better 21 days. I don't have a lot of data myself yet, but there are some data from Brazil that will suggest that 21 days is a bit better than 14. Now, there's not a lot of data on cows that have been aspirated every 14 days for more than a year. If you see that experiment from Pietro, the donors were aspirated every 30 days. But I would say between 2 to 3 weeks is probably a good idea. If you want to keep your donors for a long time, probably 3 weeks is better than 2, because it gives them time to recover. When you do an OPU, you're doing an intervention, so you are using anesthesia, and you are actually puncturing those ovaries, and you want that ovary to recover very well. So I'm probably a bit more conservative on that.
That looks to be at the end of the questions, Dr. Gabriel.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. And as you just referred about Professor Jaswant Singh, I mean, definitely I had a talk with him, and, for the prepubertal cows OPU, we are going to have him talking with our group in the month of September. So
That's very good.
Yeah.
Jaswant is doing a great work in Canada with the prepubertal cows. Yes.
And recently he visited, when he visited his native place in India, he had been to one of the universities over there in Punjab, a veterinary universities where they are doing a good work on the IVF, the lab in Punjab. And definitely I'm also looking for a talk from the Ruben Mappletoff also, because I know him for a few years. So that's one thing. And before we conclude, I would like to just quickly introduce you to the core committee, Government of India. We made a core committee to help our colleagues into the various labs with whatever experience, little experience, which our members have got it, and accreditation of the lab. So here I would like to introduce Dr. Sanjeev Chaubal. Sanjeev, you can just say, put your video on, and just, Rajan, Dr. Sanjeev. Sir, Sanjeev Chaubal is working with the Transova Genetics in USA for the last 20 years. And basically, he's from India. So he is one of my core committee member, Dr. Sanjeev. He is at Maryland lab. Sanjeev, you want to ask anything? I mean, to sir?
I already asked several questions, but Professor Bo, really an excellent presentation. I remember having met you a couple of times in conferences, and actually one of your students, I think her name was Paula. She was from
Paula
Brazil.
Rodriguez. Yes.
Yeah, Paula Rodriguez. She actually came to Transova several years ago, and we trained her. We actually wanted to work with you guys, but unfortunately it didn't work out. But hopefully in future sometime we can again collaborate. But again, lot of good tips from you always, and an excellent presentation as always. Thank you very much.
Then
Thank
I
you.
invite-
And I remember when we sent Paula to there.
Yeah.
Paula is now working in Recombinectis in the US. She's now in the US.
Or is she? Okay. I will try to connect with her. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank
And
you.
well, I also read some of your papers as well. So,
Thank you.
and I remember meeting you and our friend Hong as well.
Yeah. And probably you know Rajesh Jaiswal. Have you heard of him? Because he also worked with Dr. Meppertoff in same university.
Who you said?
Rajesh Jaiswal.
Yes,
Rajesh.
yes, Rashesh. Yes, I know Rashesh as well.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, I
Yeah,
do.
he's
Yes.
a very good friend
Yeah.
of mine. Very good friend.
Oh, very good, very good.
even Dr.
Excellent, very
A.K.
excellent.
Mishra, Dr. A.K. Mishra has also worked with the European Mappletoft. Dr. A.K.
Yes, he
Mishra.
did as well.
He's
Yes, he
also
did.
one of our member. He's also one of our member. Yeah.
Oh, very good, very good,
Yeah.
very good.
The
Excellent.
the world is very small, Dr. Gabriel. We are so well
That's
connected.
right.
Yeah. Now I would like to introduce you to my another colleague, Dr. Siddharth Laik. Siddharth,
Yes,
you are
sir.
there? Yeah, Siddharth, sir, he is working with a very important organization in the country known as National Dairy Development Board. They really do a great job, and they have an excellent lab also, IVF lab. So he is heading the lab. You want to say, Siddharth, anything just for quickly in a minute or so?
Yes. It was great listening. I following your articles since I started working in IVF during my PhD. I worked in Cornell University shortly for 1 year in Cornell University with Dr. R.H. Fute's lab. So there I worked in IVF and then I continued here in NDDV. Regarding the stimulation, we are seeing the similar result in buffaloes, where we are not getting much with unstimulated ovaries. We are not getting much great conversion. While in stimulated, we are seeing a better conversion. We did so far around 15 trials, and we are getting around 42 embryos we produced. So in stimulated, we are getting better conversion. While there is no difference between the groups in getting the oocyte numbers. The numbers are almost same, around 7 to 10 oocytes we are getting in both the groups. But while conversion, it is like double in case when we are doing stimulation. We are now going into a single injection stimulation, but with very limited data. That's also working pretty nice, like one single sort of FSH and then doing the OPU around 48 hours after the injection. So I'll definitely
How much FSH are you using? You're
So
using Voltropin or what are you giving?
Yes, we are giving Voltropin, and it's 1/4 vial we are using. 1/4.
Okay. Yeah, 5 ml.
Yes.
Okay.
No,
that's good. That's what we are using. And the other thing that we are working on, but I don't have data to show you yet, but we are playing around with this recombinant ECG that we have in Argentina because it's very cheap. And so that's something to look into. If I'm collaborating with the lab that is producing that in Argentina, and we are the other day we have a course for our master students, and I have a nephew that is now working in Spain. You probably know him, Daniel Martinez from Galicia. Maybe some of you know him, and I set up the donors for him to practice with a very small dose with 500 units of this recombinant ECG, and we got very nice oocytes, and we produce some embryos. So I'm very interested in that because it's a lot cheaper than Voltropin. So that will be an alternative. In here, we have the same problem as you guys. We do use FSH, but only in a limited number of donors because most of our clients do not want to pay the extra cost of the Voltropin. So I would say that probably 90% of the donors that are aspirated in Argentina are without FSH, mainly because the clients are not willing to pay the cost. Now in Buffalo, where you are producing a lot more embryos, I think that the Voltropin pays. I think in Holstein it does pay as well, but sometimes it's not that easy to convince the client when they need to spend an extra $100 for the fall dropping. So that is sometimes the challenge.
I want to add a few things into this, Dr. Gabriel. India's milk production, almost 50% comes from the buffalo. And we have one of the best buffalo breeds in the world, known as a Murrah. And about the cost of this fall dropping, which costs almost about $200 for a vial, it's really very expensive. And but it's very promising to work with the buffaloes. And we had one of the speaker of Petro's student only, Julia Source. Probably know her also, the Nelsio Source and Julia. So, so she also talked to us.
Nelsio's wife.
Nelsio's
wife.
Yeah, she's Nelsio's wife is Julia Source now. Yeah. So I had been to their farm and all that. So that's very interesting working with the buffaloes also. Now, just quickly, I won't take much of your time. The third of my colleague is Dr. Amol Sahare is there. Dr. Amol?
No, sir, he is not joined, sir.
Okay, I think in Muttarav is also not there, and
Yes.
Ajay is also not there. So with that, Dr. Gabriel, I mean, really, we will love to have, if you have some project to collaborate in any way with us in the India, with any university or the department, I mean, or through this International Embryo Transfer Society, whichever way, we are in a growing phase, and I tell you, as an infant stage, and then if support from a scientist like you, and it will be really great help, or having some sort of a collaborative project, because our present reason of our cost is very high as far as the establishment of the IVF pregnancies in India. It almost to the tune of about $300, and for an Indian farmer, it really becomes quite difficult to pay. The government is trying to subsidize it, and the main reason is that we have to import the media, and then the add duty almost 30-35% on that, and many of the consumables which we have to import it, that all adds into the cost. And right now, as I told you, we are in initial stages. So our the blastocyst rate has to improve, and our a number of embryo production per OP also definitely needs to improve. But with the some tips which we are getting it from the learned speakers like you, really is always helpful. So my members are always, they are very happy with such type of webinars, and they always look forward for that. With that note, Dr. Gabriel, I thank you very much, and I look forward to meet you in August 2019 at the SBT meeting in Brazil. So with that, I again say thank you in Indian way, and namaste. Thank you very much. With that, I declare this, unless you have to say something, I declare this meeting as a closed. Is it okay?
Yeah, no, I just want to thank you very much, and sure, I'm very happy to collaborate in whatever way you think I'm useful, and we can talk more at the SBT, and thank you very much for inviting me.
And I look forward for your visit to India. As you said, this is one of the country which is left. So really, if you, it will be our pleasure to have you as our guest for the country. That I can tell you that.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
sir. And
Thank you very much.
Have a good day ahead, and good evening to all my colleagues in India. And I declare this webinar closed. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.